and welcome to Beyond the Knife, a medical history podcast brought to you by Surgeons Hall, Museums, Library and Archives. We are part of the Royal College of Surgeons of Edinburgh. I am Chanté, Director of Heritage and Estates at the college. Each episode, I'm joined by a guest who shares a story from the history of medicine and surgery. This episode contains discussions on topics that some people may find distressing. Please take care while listening. For over a century, the 8th of March has been recognised as International Women's Day, a global celebration of women's achievements and a call for gender equality. The idea for this day was first proposed in the early 20th century by American labour activist and suffragist Theresa Kielty, with a visionary focus on women's rights. It was officially celebrated for the first time in March 1911, and it quickly gained international recognition, with more governments and organisations acknowledging its significance each year. Today is the 8th of March 2025, and here at Surgeons Hall we are thrilled to bring you a special episode of Beyond the Knife. We are joined by midwife, award-winning writer and women's health activist Leah Hazard, who shares her insights and experiences both as a practitioner and a patient in the field of women's reproductive health. Today we're discussing Leah's most recent book, Womb, and we touch on her future book, Birth Wars. We hope you enjoy the episode. So Leah, welcome to the podcast. It's really wonderful to have you here. Before we start, I have a warm-up question for you that we put to each of our guests. So Leah, tell us, if you could be present for any moment in the history of medicine, what would it be and why?
Well, this is a great question, and I thought long and hard about it. And I'm going to give you two answers. So I have a kind of professional answer and I have a kind of personal answer as well. So my professional answer is I would have loved to have been there when Alexander Fleming came back to his workbench and realized that there was this funny mold growing in his petri dish that had killed all the bacteria around about it, and apparently was the moment when he discovered the effects of penicillin. So I think that must have been pretty mind-blowing for him, but also such a significant moment for us globally, in medicine, that I think to be present at that moment would have been quite something. And my personal answer actually is about my dad. So my father was a molecular microbiologist and biochemist. And in the mid-80s, he discovered something about the catalytic properties of RNA, which I'm not really clever enough to explain, but you can certainly look it up. And that became kind of the foundation for the rest of his career. He achieved a bit of success around that. And I would have loved to have been there with him in the lab when he realized what he'd seen, because I was only, I would have been 9 or 10 years old. I wouldn't have understood the significance. But me as an adult now, I think must have been tremendously exciting.
And Leah, today we're talking about your book, Womb, which I have here. But before we go into the book, tell us a little bit more about yourself and your work.
Sure. Well, I'm as surprised as anyone that I'm talking to you today in this context, because I never imagined that I would be A, midwife, B, writing books, and C, writing about science. When I was growing up, I was really into books and drama, but in a much more kind of creative way. And my parents were both scientists, but I thought of myself as kind of the black sheep who wasn't very good at science. And so I went on to study English literature, and then I got a master's degree in directing, and that was kind of the way I was headed, and started working in television behind the scenes. And then when my first daughter was born in 2003, I had quite a difficult birth experience, as many people unfortunately do. And it really pushed me in a different direction to start thinking about why this had been the case, and the whole world of maternity and reproductive health care, and why there are the problems that there are. And gradually I kind of shifted gear. So I left television, began working as a doula, which is like a lay birth companion, had another child, and finally decided the time was right to maybe go a bit further and study midwifery, which I did. So I went back to school and I qualified as a midwife in 2013. And I have been doing that for 11 years. And along the way, I realized that there were some points about midwifery that I would like to communicate to the public, and that became my first commercially published book, Hard Pushed, which came out in 2019. And then I thought, well, I'd really like to do that again in a different way, which we can talk about today. And that became Womb, which was published in hardback last year. And now writing is a big part of what I do, amazingly. So yeah, I'm as surprised and delighted as anyone that that's the case.
So your book Womb starts and actually I think finishes with talking about your visit here to Surgeons Hall Museums, so to the galleries which are just above me in that direction. As a midwife today, what was it like visiting the historical collections?
It was amazing. I mean, I really geek out on that kind of thing, and sort of the grosser and the weirder, the better. So you can imagine the Surgeons Hall Museums is just, I mean, I could spend hours. And I had been there before with my girls when they were a bit younger, because my older daughter, who's actually now a medical student, had always been interested in that kind of thing as well. But then when I had the sort of very early ideas for this book, so we're talking kind of 2020 into 2021, I was actually in Edinburgh one day to visit my daughter, and I was a little bit early, and I thought, well, I'll just pop into the museum, pass the time, kind of see if there's any wombs that I can check out. And as I describe in the opening sequence of the book, when I kind of wound my way through the museum to the gynecology section at the back, it was just such a powerful moment for me to be face to face with these face to womb with these specimens that had been so carefully preserved, and to read the very short descriptions of the medical conditions that were being illustrated with these specimens, and to think about the women who, knowingly or not, donated their organs so that we could then learn and study. It just was so powerful for me. And I thought, wow, what a great way to open a book as well. To bring the reader along on my journey of um, amazement and awe and curiosity, and to allow us really to learn together about this organ.
So the collections here, yeah, contain a lot of material relating to wombs. And I think, so I started working here about a year ago. And one of the things that I was really struck by are things called calcified fibroma or womb stones. Well, they were called that. So there are examples that date back to the 1800s. And I'm going to describe one in particular, which is very large, that is in the collection. And I'm going to read this description so that I get it right. So imagine a type of growth, and that's the fibroid. And over time, some fibroids can develop a hard outer layer due to calcium deposits. So building up on their surface, and it's like a soft center surrounded by a thick hardened shell. So this particular example that I'm thinking of, we can see just the shell of this densely calcified material from which the soft part of the growth has been removed. And on occasion, the entire fibroid can calcify as well. So in terms of this historic example, can you tell us a little bit about how these compare to what happens today?
Well, I mean, the human body is pretty much unchanged. So any phenomena that women would have experienced back in the time that you're talking about, they're still experiencing now. Fibroids are benign tumors or masses that grow in, on, and around the uterus. And they're very, very common. I don't have the exact stats to hand, but you can certainly read the book and remind me, read for yourself. And they are more common in Black women. There are various treatments for fibroids, but they can cause, sometimes they can be, undetected. People aren't aware that they have them, but sometimes they can cause significant pain, very heavy menstrual bleeding, sometimes can interfere with fertility, pregnancy and birth. So can potentially be really problematic. Um, and awareness around fibroids is there, but it's growing, which is kind of bittersweet given that they're probably as old as, people themselves. And this image that you've just described of the sort of calcified fibroid with the sort of soft part taken away and just the hard outer, almost eggshell remaining, I think is really powerful. Because there's a fibroid that's kind of stood the test of time. I mean, who knows who that woman was that was sort of carrying that around in her womb? And in a way, who knows, which of us really knows what we're carrying around in our own wombs these days? Our uteruses are mysteries to so many of us. And that sense of mystery was part of what inspired me to write the book.
And you have a wonderful way of maintaining, well, you don't maintain the mystery. I guess you sort of illuminate it while providing evidence. I mean, I have never learned so much about what's inside my own body reading your book. Going back as well to the 1800s, there are examples of womb stones or fibroids found in graves, and they were referred as well to as hagstones. Is that right? And because they were misunderstood, they linked to witchcraft. So the idea that women who died, this was evidence after their death that they were witches.
Yeah, I mean, I wasn't aware of the term hagstone for these fibroids until recently, but it's so evocative, isn't it? I mean, women have been accused of witchcraft for so many spurious reasons, and the fact that one of those reasons could be these totally involuntary growths that we have in our wombs is just, yeah, it's sad, but quite powerful as well, and unsurprising in a way that a very common growth in the female body could be demonized in this way. I mean, there are lots of descriptions of sort of witch inspectors examining women's bodies in the witchcraft trials of the 16th and 17th centuries. And apparently one of the proofs that a woman was a witch was if she had a witch's nipple, which was actually the clitoris. So there are descriptions of men sort of examining these women and finding this, kind of protruding small structure and taking this as proof that this woman was unnatural and must absolutely therefore be a witch. And it just goes along with this whole literally demonization of women's very normal bodies.
The other thing that really comes through in your book as well is both the advancement of medicine and the way things have improved, and we have a growing awareness of how bodies work, but also how that sometimes is not applied in a useful way. So I'm thinking about, you have an incredible description of women giving birth being really, really encouraged to rush the process, and whether that's through medication or drugs, being on a sort of hospital conveyor belt. And sometimes that is just not useful. One of the things we have in the collection here, which is really powerful, is a birthing chair, like an obstetrics birthing chair. And this is a wooden chair which could be bolted to the ground. And when I first started working here, we had a temporary exhibition called In Safe Hands, which was about midwifery. And I had the opportunity just to watch people engage with the exhibition. And the number of women who stood in front of that chair and went, "Oh, that's a good idea," was actually really remarkable. Like, "Oh, yeah, sitting up, that kind of makes sense." Tell us a little bit more about how, while medicine has evolved, we still don't have the balance right.
Oh gosh, absolutely. Just first of all, to go back to the image of the birthing chair. So when I first went on that visit to the Surgeons' Hall Museums and was thinking about the early stage of this book, I saw that chair, which I think was called the obstetrical chair in the little tag in the exhibit. And there was a note on the tag that if needed, the chair could be bolted or screwed into the floor. And I thought, amazing. And there's a line in Womb about the fact that I saw that chair and that it could be bolted to the floor in case the sort of volcanic force of a laboring woman was so uncontrollable that, she'd be like rocketed into the sky if she wasn't screwed to the ground. But it's true, as a midwife for over 11 years now, I've seen so many women birthing and I've seen the power of their bodies, that to think of many, many women sitting in that chair and going through that experience is pretty powerful. To your point of trying to control and even accelerate our bodily processes, definitely that's something that I see all the time as an NHS midwife. And as I write in the book, I've been complicit in that process many times because, have to follow guidelines and protocols and do the job that's expected of me. But as you said, it's not only is it not always helpful, it's not always safe. And I think that's something that has kind of been lost along the way, that we got so caught up in this idea of progress, this idea of the woman's body as a kind of risky, unpredictable machine that we could control and manage. We've sort of forgotten to do the safety checks along the way. And for this next book I'm writing, I've been speaking to a lot of eminent obstetricians and midwives, and they say that a lot of the tools that we now, take for granted in maternity care would never pass a modern safety audit or a randomized controlled trial. Because when they were introduced, whether it be something in the 1860s or the 1950s, this kind of rigorous safety control and scrutiny just didn't exist. But these tools and techniques and medications became part of our toolkit with little question, and we still use them today.
I think another amazing example of that is, of course, the surgical practice of the cesarean, which I had no idea how far back that dated, and is, of course, still used today.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, it's so difficult when you write about cesarean sections, because mode of delivery or mode of birth is a very emotive subject. People feel very strongly about those things, and I think people expect a midwife to take a certain stance either way about, cesarean section is good or bad, black or white. And I took great pains to ensure that really, I hope, is not the case in the book. I've had a cesarean section myself. I've been present and facilitated at many cesarean sections. And the history of the procedure is really fascinating, particularly as it pertains to Scottish medicine, actually, with the first section under antiseptic conditions being performed at the Glasgow Maternity Hospital, and also facilitated by the work done by Lister elsewhere. And so it's really interesting to delve into the history of the operation, also to recognize that it goes way back in time. People were performing cesarean sections potentially for many hundreds of years before they became quote unquote safe. And we have to recognize that this is something that's been developed in many different cultures over many years.
And then, of course, in the book as well, you talk about what are really cutting edge on new practices. So I was fascinated to read about the womb transplant.
Yeah, so this was definitely a pinch me moment for me. When I started researching the book, in fact, this was one of the very first chapters that I was looking at in terms of future wombs and future reproductive technologies. And I found out about this concept of uterus transplant. And I looked up the sort of main pioneer of the procedure, whose name is Mats Brunstrom. He's a obstetrician gynecologist in Gothenburg in Sweden. And I emailed him and I said, I found out about your work. This is fascinating to me, that you've performed successful uterus transplants and women have been able to have successful pregnancies and transplanted wombs. Could I maybe do a Zoom interview with you if you have the time? And he wrote me back a kind of one-line email saying, yes, that's fine. I'm doing one in November. You can come. My secretary will be in touch. And I wouldn't have even asked to be there, or to observe that. But people can be incredibly generous with their time and expertise. So I ended up going to Sweden in, I think it was December of 2019. So lucky, because it was just before we knew about COVID and all the travel restrictions. And I, along with some other observers, was able to watch uterus transplant over the course of about 12 hours. And although uterus transplants are still in the kind of experimental stage around the world and are not in common practice, I think this will potentially be a big part of our reproductive technology in the future, because it allows women who were either born without a womb or had their womb removed at an early age to gestate and carry their own biological children. And we can debate the ethics of this, and we can debate whether it's a good use of resources, and it's important to ask those questions, which I do in the book. Just being able to observe that procedure and see the science and the medicine that enabled that to happen was just phenomenal.
Leah, throughout your book, there was a really nice example, really, where you are meeting so many different people that are working in the field now, and they are working across a whole breadth of really different kinds of health issues or different discoveries or advancements. And you describe a lot of really lovely Zoom calls like the one that we're on at the moment. So talking to people from across the world with so much like primary source material. In terms of writing, how do you decide what to prioritize? How do you choose what goes in, what doesn't?
Uh, I guess it's just kind of a feeling in some cases. I mean, in some cases, it's obvious who are the big movers and shakers that you need to speak to. So, for example, like with the womb transplants, Mats Brandstrom is the pioneering doctor for that technique. And I thought, well, that's the big get, as they say in showbiz. Like, that's the person you want to speak to hear directly about the development of the procedure and his thoughts around it and what he hopes to achieve. And that was great. But in some cases, it's just a feeling of, somebody having a really compelling story or being able to express themselves really well. Some stories came to me kind of semi-anonymously or anonymously through social media, had some really, really incredibly poignant stories about hysterectomy, for example, from just a call I put out on Twitter, saying, does anybody want to share their story with me? And people sent in really moving kind of personal testimonies. So I try and kind of go where the story is. And if there's something that really excites me or moves me, then I hope that the reader will have the same response.
And throughout your story, you have this wonderful way of writing where you sort of manage to contextualize everything within history while still being forward-looking. In terms of your upcoming book, Birthing Wars, what do you think the future is? What are the next steps in terms of really reproductive health?
Yeah, so with Birth Wars, it's interesting because it's kind of zooming back in on my area of expertise and passion, which is maternity care. And it's looking at some of the really significant factors that influence how that care is delivered and experienced around the world in the 21st century. So, for example, there are chapters on climate change and artificial intelligence in maternity and birth for migrant women and birth for incarcerated people. We talk about free birth. We talk about um, the sort of quote unquote normal birth discourse. And there are lots of, I hope, really fascinating human stories in this book as well. But what I'm pointing to in terms of the future of birth care is that we've really reached a tipping point where, on the whole, maternity care around the world, particularly in developed countries, is so industrialized that we've kind of started getting it really, really wrong for most people in an attempt to develop this kind of one size fits all sort of general standard of safety. We've actually failed to get it right for most people. And the reason why that's so important is not just because birth is a tremendously powerful individual event, but because what happens in that perinatal year actually has a massive ripple effect for public health as a whole. So, of course, women's health is important in its own right. Birth isn't just a women's thing. That woman will be affected forever. Her family, her partner, her colleagues, the people she knows, works with, loves, will be affected in many different ways. And that baby, that child that's born, will also then grow up to be an adult in the world. And we know that there are some factors around birth that will influence that baby, that adult's health for the rest of their lives. So by failing to get this right, we're setting ourselves up for a massive global public health crisis in the future. So hopefully try and close with some ways that we can maybe avert or kind of moderate that crisis and zoom back into kind of more humanized form of care.
And that does come through in womb as well, that we have a tendency, and I think this is true in the development of medicine generally, but particularly so for maybe women's bodies, to standardize and say, okay, well, this is how the uterus should perform. This is how the womb should perform. If it's not doing that, then it's hostile or it's not competent, as opposed to actually starting from the position that each person is probably going to be slightly different. There are parts of the body that we still don't understand. And that idea of taking the opportunity to adapt to individual needs to really inform a bigger process.
Yeah, and I mean, I can understand why there's the temptation to standardize care across the board, right? Because we want to know which things work for most people. And if we're organizing health services at scale, i.e. for the whole of the UK or for the whole of the United States or whatever, then yeah, we need to have some general guidelines, some idea of what might be not only safe, but cost effective and efficient and productive. But the problem is that women's bodies are not widgets on an assembly line. We are not cost effective entities. We're not productive in the way that modern industrialized society defines productivity. We have value and we have worth in other ways that are incredibly meaningful, maybe not always in ways that can be quantified and quote unquote improved upon by massive medical structures. So any kind of medicine, but I think especially reproductive medicine, has to really tread this fine balance between existing, on a large scale in the way that we need it to, but also being safe and appropriate and holistic for individuals. And I'm not the person in charge. I don't have all the answers for how that's going to happen. I certainly don't have the money, but I think being mindful of that balance is a really important first step.
What also came across in your book was the need for to make information accessible to people. So people undergoing different procedures and different processes so that they can be aware and make choices as well, and informed choices. I'm very sad to say that I did not know that the synthetic hormone that I took for a lot of my life as birth control, the period that I had on that doesn't perform a medical function. I honestly thought that was just keeping everything going. I needed to have that period. And I remember, I think I was sitting in my car waiting to get on the train, reading that chapter. And I read that and I was so just outraged. I wanted to open my car and tell everybody about it. And just to think of all the periods I could have possibly avoided. I think that was so shocking to me. And I am like a 45-year-old woman living today, right? But that need then to be able to understand or know what's happening or know what the options are, so that when one is having conversations with medical professionals, there's an ability to really inform or help really guide the different practices that are happening.
Yeah, it's so important to be informed, but it's really, really hard. I think there's a lot of kind of chat in the media, and rightly so, about inform yourself, arm yourself for these interactions. But in a sense, part of that is kind of unhelpful because it puts the onus on the patient to know everything, to push for everything, to be aware of, the pros and cons and risks and benefits of every option. And we're not all doctors, we can't all do that. I talk a bit in Womb about my own gynecological journey, which has only just 6 weeks ago finally resulted in a hysterectomy. So that'll maybe be another book for another time. But I found it incredibly difficult, even being like the womb lady, to go into my gynecology appointments and advocate for myself, and ask the right questions and know what was safest and best for me. And if I found that difficult with my privilege and my knowledge, then how is that going to feel for just kind of Jane Doe in the street? It's very, very difficult. The system doesn't make it easy. And it's, so timely that today, on the day we're recording this, there's been this big report released in the news. I think it was a parliamentary inquiry into women's health, saying that medical misogyny is holding back women's health in this country. Women are victims of medical gaslighting, denial, trivialization, subject to incredibly painful procedures without anesthetic. It is infuriating. That anger that you felt that day reading about your false period is an anger that I feel probably all the more so after writing this book. But, it can be righteous anger. We have to try and channel it in the right way. With this sort of false period that you're talking about, for people who haven't read the book or might not be aware of what we're talking about, a lot of people who take the oral contraceptive pill are told that, you'll take the pill for so many days of the month, and then you'll stop the pill for a few days and you'll have a period, and then you'll resume the pill again, and that cycle will just continue because your body needs to have periods, and it's better to kind of, you know, I don't know, clear things out once a month, and it's more like your normal cycle, and that's just the way it'll be. And many of us, like you, have just gone, years of our lives thinking, okay, that's what my doctor told me. I'm having a period every month on the pill, that's fine. But actually, when you go back into the history of the contraceptive pill and how it was developed by Carl Djerassi, there was some concern when the pill was invented that women wouldn't feel okay about never having a period and just sort of continuously taking hormones. And it also wouldn't be acceptable to religious leaders because it would be seen as somehow kind of unnatural or unwomanly. So there was some consultation with the Pope, and it was decided in union with the head of the Catholic Church that even though women didn't need to have this bleed on the pill once a month, that they should have it. And when you're taking the contraceptive pill for a number of days and then you stop, the bleed that you have isn't actually menstruation in the sense that it's not your body's spontaneous way of shedding the lining of the womb and an egg in the way that it normally would. It's actually just a withdrawal bleed. Because you're no longer receiving that daily progesterone in the form of the pill, your body then releases the lining of the womb in response to that drop in hormone. And it's generally a consensus now in the scientific community that there's actually no physiological need to have that bleed every month. And that it is safe to run packs of the pill together. And of course, you should always consult your doctor. Don't take my advice. Don't start doing something different just because you've heard me say this. But I do quote the various professional bodies in the book as saying that generally for many people it is safe to run packs of the pill together, and you don't need to have this withdrawal bleed, this false period. So I can absolutely understand if you were enraged upon reading about this in the book. And I think I felt a lot of rage while I was writing the book. I still am very angry after having written it, but it's possible for us to channel that rage into kind of righteous anger and hopefully use it in ways that are productive.
The other thing I found really fascinating reading the book is that you talk about outside of birth, all the other things that the uterus does, the womb does, in terms of regulating the overall health of our bodies, as well as menopause and what happens post-menopause too. And I really liked the references as well that you pull into popular culture and popular understanding of women post-menopause, because it does feel like that is becoming a topic that is talked about a lot more in some parts of the world. And it is probably because I am 45 that this is obviously entering my zone as well. But it is interesting as well, the incredibly important point that this part of our bodies does so much more, or does so many various things that we also don't really understand yet.
Yeah, there's this sort of idea in obstetrics and gynecology that the female reproductive system isn't really doing much if there isn't a penis going in or a baby coming out. And that always raises a bit of a giggle, but it's actually true. It's actually a very serious point. We just sort of generally think that if you're not somehow welcoming penetrative sex with a male or gestating and producing a child, that your body is just kind of there, that it's just kind of hanging out, not doing much. And nothing could be further from the truth. The female reproductive system is a very dynamic, ever-changing, interesting system, and essential component of our health and our bodies. And so it was really important to me when I thought about the content and the structure of the book that I would sort of dive into this question of, okay, well, what is the uterus doing the rest of the time? What is it for? And why should we pay attention to it?
Yeah, you really create this picture of the uterus as a very active thing, which I have to say I didn't, it really, again, changed how I saw it, which was fantastic. So Leah, your next book comes out in 2025?
Probably 2027, just because that is the way publishing works. I'm about 60% through the rough draft right now, but publishers, when they want to sort of release something with a bang. They like to have quite a long lead time, not only for editing, but for publicity and marketing and things. So yeah, a couple of years to wait for that, but it's very much in the works. I'm also writing some fiction at the moment, which I am not allowed to talk about, but I'm excited for. So anybody who wants to know more about my kind of upcoming projects can absolutely follow me on Instagram or Blue Sky. I'm not on the bad place anymore. Um, and I'm very easy to sort of access and get in touch with if people have questions or comments about my work.
Thank you so much for joining us today, Leah.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening to Beyond the Knife, a medical history podcast brought to you by Surgeons Hall Museums, Library and Archives. To find out more about us, you can visit www.museum.rcsed.ac.uk.